Welcome to MEnbar, the podcast of the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. I'm your host, Marc Owen Jones. Today, we have the privilege of being joined by Omar Rahman, who's a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs and also the editor of Akfar, Middle East Council's portal for getting all the latest analysis and insights on the Middle East. And Omar is an expert on Palestine and Gaza and the Middle East more broadly, and we're really lucky to have him here today. Straight off a red eye, Omar?
That's right. Yeah, I came from Boston, but so glad to be here with you, Mark.
Yeah, great to see you. So today we're going to be looking, at what's happening in the region. But I was trying to figure out what Israel's vision of the region was, and I went back to look at Netanyahu's speech at the United Nations General Assembly. And to me, it was pretty wild, not least because he held up props, which he has now a tendency to do, showing the Middle East, the map of the Middle East, divided into two regions, the blessing and the curse. And the curse was painted black and the blessing was painted green. And this is stuck in my head. And it also stuck in my head because I think Netanyahu gave a bit of a diatribe of what his vision of the region was. And I want to ask you how you would interpret Netanyahu's speech at the UNGA, because I think that's a good in for this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, Netanyahu has been in power so long and has given so many speeches at the UN that he's, these very theatrical speeches where he often uses props.
And does that include the people who are clapping for him?
Yes, I mean, I think actually most of the audience had left, most of the countries, and so he had his own cheering section. But that aside, Netanyahu's a propagandist par excellence, and I think much of his credibility on the international stage is diminished, and most people aren't buying his message anymore. At the same time, I think he's speaking to an American audience in which there is some residual, respect for Netanyahu, or at least listening to him, as well as an Israeli audience. I'd love not to dignify his his speech with an analysis, but at the same time, even in propaganda, you can search for things to understand and to even to debunk or demystify. Yes, he came with those posters of what's a blessing and what's a curse, which, it's a biblical reference to Moses, which he said. But it was a bit nonsensical, to be honest, because the blessing and curse that Moses was talking about was, as the Hebrews were on the precipice of entering the Holy Land, he said, if you'll be, by your actions, you will bequeath to future generations a blessing or a curse. So if you, conform to your belief in God and what he's asked of you, then you're going to, by your righteousness, bequeath a blessing to your people. And I think Israel has not bequeathed a blessing; it's bequeathed a curse to the region. So his own point of view and how he framed it, I think, was a bit nonsensical.
I mean, it's not his first problematic biblical reference.
Yeah, I mean, but there are other things he said. He started off with, my country is fighting for its life, and this really gets to the heart of one of the major dimensions of the past year, in terms of how Israel has framed things and how its defenders have in terms of Israel's right to self-defense. All its backers, the United States and Europe and elsewhere, Israel has a right to self-defense, and we support Israel's right to defense. And it's very much like Israel's right to exist, which we've heard for years. Do you support Israel's right to exist? But it's a bit of a misleading question and a misleading proposition. What is Israel? That's really the question. And then you understand if it has a right to exist or a right to defend itself. Is Israel a normal country, just going about its business in its state and it's being attacked or harassed from outside? No, that's not the full picture of what Israel is. Israel is, according to the International Court of Justice, has an unlawful occupation that's been going on for 57 years, has an apartheid regime in place. And so Israel's not just defending itself as such, it's defending an apartheid regime, it's defending a regime of Jewish supremacism over another people. And that's who's resisting that. And so you have to look at that full picture when you're talking about self-defense. And there's other things he said. Israel yearns for peace, and it wants to make peace. But his point of view or his vision of the future has no place for Palestinian self-determination.
Right.
And that is the political solution and the peaceful solution that people are seeking. And if you have none of that, then what his version of peace is, his definition of peace, is essentially Palestinian capitulation, not Palestinian self-determination. So that's not a vision of peace that we recognize. He also, one of the things that people that came out of that speech was this message to Iran. Like, we have a message to Iran.
Right.
The long arm of Israel can reach anywhere in Iran and reach anybody in Iran. And I think that was really an important dimension of his speech. And he also said, it can reach not just in Iran, but anywhere in the region. And so it's very much a threat. And I think that's a huge part of this, because I think one of the things that happened after Hamas's attack on October 7th was, a real sense of vulnerability in Israel. Its feeling of invincibility, even vis-a-vis somebody that it controlled the entire life of in the Gaza Strip was Hamas. And Hamas's attack really exposed Israel's vulnerability. And so the just overwhelming assault on Gaza, the overwhelming use of force in Lebanon, was meant to deter the region and say, you want to attack us? Look what we can do. Look what we can inflict upon you. And we can do it anywhere, and nobody's going to stop us from doing that. And so that is a huge element of what we've seen. And they issued those threats to Lebanon well before what we're seeing today. Yeah. Early on, Beirut will become like Gaza. And so, that's a huge aspect. And then finally, I think, he talked about Israel winning and Israel is fighting on behalf of the world. But, truly, is Hamas and Hezbollah Israel's problem or the world's problem? I see it as Israel's problem, not the world's problem. Those aren't threats to the world. It's this megalomania, this, if anything, Israel is the biggest threat to the international system. It's the one undermining the world order, the rule of law. It is the rogue state at this moment, the nuclear armed state that's acting unhinged. And so, it's not Hamas that's threatening the entire world. It's really the Israelis.
You mentioned unhinged there, which I thought was very interesting, because Netanyahu's speech to me and that picture, the blessing and the curse, did also come across as a slightly unhinged rant. And as you said, he opened it by saying Israel is fighting for its life, which is a slogan. It sounds like electioneering. I wonder what this fighting for life, is this a reflection of lack of Israel's strategy? Netanyahu started this war saying he wanted to eradicate Hamas and save the hostages. Now we're seeing escalation in Iran. We're seeing it in Lebanon. We're seeing thousands already killed in Lebanon. And recently Biden was quoted as saying that Netanyahu had no strategy. And he was also quoted as saying a few other unpleasant things about Netanyahu. But was this speech a reflection of the fact that Israel has no strategy? Or do they have a strategy? And that strategy is actually Israeli expansionism, or just another 10 years of perceived stability? How do you see their strategy or lack thereof?
Yeah, that's an important question. And the answer is multidimensional. In a nutshell, Israel can be said to have no long-term strategy because that would involve a means for ending the conflict politically. And those in power in Israel, who are from the Israeli right, their political ideology is committed to extending Jewish sovereignty over all the land from the river to the sea, which is incompatible with Palestinian self-determination. So all that Israel has at its disposal is the use of force, which it's happy to use because it's militarily powerful. And so it uses that force to oppress Palestinians indefinitely and continually degrade the capacity of any group to resist this situation, of indefinite dispossession, and conflict. I think what Biden was criticizing was a lack of, quote unquote, day after strategy. What does Israel foresee for Gaza long term? What's the long-term resolution of conflict? And Israel has never been able to answer that in a satisfactory way for even its partners, because the U.S. and others, they say they want to see a two-state solution, and Netanyahu doesn't. It's as simple as that. The Israeli right wing, again, it wants to extend sovereignty over all the territory. I think in truth, they have historically excluded Gaza from that equation because it's so densely populated by Palestinians. That's why Ariel Sharon pulled Israel's settlements out of Gaza in 2005, because Gaza was more trouble to Israel than it was worth. But even after that, Israel's occupation of Gaza was maintained through effective control of the territory. Israel controlled Gaza's borders, its airspace, its sea space. It controlled the flow of people and goods in and out of the territory. And it maintained a blockade of Gaza for 16 years, after Hamas took over the Strip in 2007. At the same time, Netanyahu knew that a united Palestinian Authority over the West Bank and Gaza would be better positioned to push for a Palestinian state in those territories, which he opposes ideologically. So he pursued a strategy of keeping these territories physically and politically fragmented. It's a divide and rule strategy. And this, for him, was an indefinite state of affairs. Israel managing the occupation through an apartheid regime without ever addressing the core political issue of Palestinian self-determination. That he could also pursue Israel integration in the region through things like the Abraham Accords and sideline the Palestinian issue indefinitely. And October 7th shattered the illusion that this could be a permanent situation. So, what was Israel to do? I think for many of us who are close observers of this situation, we knew instantly that Israel would not accept to return to the status quo ante or to resolve the situation with the Palestinians politically. And Israel's determination to eliminate Hamas as its stated goal was impossible or irrelevant because, who would replace Hamas as the authority in Gaza if Netanyahu wanted to avoid the PA returning there? And he said, the PA cannot return here. And because it would place all the Palestinian territories under a single government, which again is too close to a Palestinian state for him or for the Israeli right. And so he set about using the grim pretext of October 7th to alter the calculation completely by destroying Gaza and forcing the population out and making sure there was nothing to return to make Gaza uninhabitable. And we saw this plan take shape in various policy papers from institutions inside and outside the government, including Israel's Ministry of Intelligence. However, to displace the population in Gaza, Egypt would have had to play ball and open its borders to millions of Palestinians, which it was unwilling to do. So I think Israel's plan became to kind of create a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions that would put pressure on Egypt to open up. And Israel has shown on its end that it cares nothing for Palestinian lives, that it's willing to kill indiscriminately tens of thousands of children. And so if there wasn't mass expulsion, I think the Israeli intention here is to keep its military in Gaza long term, to occupy, but not in the traditional sense of policing and providing administrative services, but keeping a long-term military presence that can put pressure on the Palestinian population, and maybe it thins out over time. And those are the words of Netanyahu himself.
He said thins out.
Yes.
So basically make conditions for life intolerable or make the place uninhabitable so people leave.
Exactly.
So that means no rebuilding. That just means living amongst ruins with an Israeli military occupation.
I think that's it. And they've tried to make room for maybe some Arab states to come in there as what I've called a version of the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority, what's its role today in the occupied territories? It is basically an extension of Israel's occupation regime that administers and polices the Palestinian population centers in the West Bank on Israel's behalf, but there's no movement towards statehood or any other kind of political resolution. I think they would bring countries in the region to fill that same kind of thing, to police and administer the Palestinian population center. Israel would be in charge of security, just like it is in the West Bank, and so it wouldn't pay any of the cost or have any of that type of burden.
Didn't the UAE volunteer? Wasn't there some story about that?
So these Arab states have all rejected that premise, right, unless there is a political component to this, and that's the rub, basically. Right. There's another component. That's the proximate cause. The other thing is, we're not operating in a vacuum. There's 120 years of history informing this particular moment, and that's that Israel has always faced a dilemma of wanting to take over this land for itself and create its state on the entirety of the land, or at least parts of it, and the Palestinian population that was living there. And so again, it's tried to manage and slowly displace the population. At various times, like in 1948, it was able to go through a mass expulsion in a created state. In 1967, there was another mass expulsion, but not so much, and it came to occupy the Palestinian people. It doesn't want to enfranchise those people because that would, change the demographic composition of the state, and therefore it's tried to manage them and make life intolerable so people leave. Gaza presents a thorn in Israel's side that's never been able to deal with. This is its method of dealing with it. Now it's found the kind of context or the pretext in which to try to resolve this situation in Gaza. It's finding that, I think, more difficult than it anticipated. But at the same time, I think it is using overwhelming force. Nobody's stepping in to stop what's happening in Gaza, and we're seeing a genocide take place.
So it just reminds me of the old colonial propaganda of land without people for people without a land, and it seems that Israel are actually trying to turn Gaza into a land without people to occupy further.
It's tried to do that to the West Bank as well,
right.
But obviously when it came into occupy in 1967, and it tried at various moments to force migration, and it's doing the same thing in Jerusalem. I mean, Jerusalem's a perfect microcosm. In its own words, we're seeing a process of Judaization, right? In which it's slowly trying to remove the people. It hasn't really worked that well because at the same time, and we can get into this, Israel is dependent on the United States and the West. And so the type of, forcible expulsion that you might see elsewhere, Israel hasn't always been able to engage in unless it has the pretext of war, which is what we're seeing now, which is what we saw in 1948, which was what we saw in 1967. Otherwise, it's trying to do kind of a gradual re-engineering of the demographics and the territorial control over time. That's what it's done in Jerusalem, through the building of settlements, through not allowing people to build, and therefore it destroys their houses. It does it through, their residency rights, and it takes all types of methods in order to reach that same goal.
And that settlement, that's an important thing in the past year, is settlement expansion has accelerated, right?
Oh, tremendously.
Yeah.
And we've seen the greatest expropriation of land since the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993. We've seen the expulsion of dozens of communities from their lands in the West Bank. So we've definitely seen a huge leap forward. And there's also been, legal aspects or legal strides that have been taken to move along the process of de jure annexation. Israel has, for all intents and purposes, de facto annexed the West Bank. So
this is like a sort of grand strategy, I suppose, of Israel. But where does the Lebanon part fit in? We've already seen now thousands dead in Lebanon. We've seen what looked like war crimes in the attack of personal devices, pages. We've seen attacks on. Well, we saw the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran. Where does this fit in with Netanyahu's strategy? It's moved now from Gaza. Or was this always part of a strategy?
I think fundamentally, Lebanon is the last hostile external front on Israel's borders. The relationship with Jordan has changed over time. With Egypt has changed over time. Obviously, internally, that's not the same. The Palestinians still pose a hostile front to Israel, but on its external borders, Lebanon is the last one. Once upon a time in the 1970s and 80s, the PLO was based there and used Lebanon in order to carry on kind of an armed struggle against Israel. Israel went in there in 1982 and forced the expulsion of the PLO, and in so doing and through its occupation led to the emergence of Hezbollah as an organization. And Israel went into Lebanon with the intention of transforming Lebanon in its own interest, right? For creating a state that would be friendly to Israel. And that project failed. And Iran has succeeded, I think, in keeping Lebanon open as part of its own forward defense through Hezbollah. And so Israel has tried to kind of change that reality on multiple occasions. It obviously went back in 2006. And that failed. So in a sense, I think it's shifting from, or it's using this particular episode to shift from a strategy of containment of Lebanon to something larger, in which maybe it can deal the larger axis of resistance which flows through Lebanon. Lebanon exists at least for Iran's, from its strategic point of view, as, again, that border in which Iran can put pressure on Israel through Lebanon, so that Iran cannot be attacked at home, because Hezbollah would be the forward, force on Israel's borders in which to pressure it. And so I think Israel's trying to transform that by dealing Hezbollah and the larger axis kind of a devastating blow.
This always strikes me as absolutely bizarre, because we know, and surely Netanyahu knows, for example, you can't, and as you said, Hezbollah is more than just, people often use the term when Nasrallah was assassinated that they were decapitated. And I don't like this metaphor, because decapitation supplies that you cut someone's head off, that you kill the body. Mm-hmm. It's a ludicrous metaphor, because you can't get rid of an ideology that's also a socio-cultural movement, a quasi-state entity, a political party that has a lot of organic support. Similar with Hamas, you can't just destroy an ideology. And many would argue, and Netanyahu said himself, that it was important to support Hamas if you didn't want the emergence of a Palestinian state, right? So you have a situation where it's almost like, in order for Palestinian state not to emerge, you need the enemies, including Hamas and probably Hezbollah. So how can you reconcile these two things where you say, I want to destroy this organization, but at the same time you act in a way that the existence of that organization or organizations is actually essential to your long-term goals? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
I don't know if there's an answer, right?
As much as it could make sense, it makes sense. Yes, I agree. You can't defeat these movements by taking out their leadership, right? And that's been proven over their history, both of them. Hamas has had its leadership killed over time, all of it, and so has Hezbollah's leadership or leader been killed, and various people assassinated. And it doesn't, it may set back the institution, it may, but it's always temporary, it's always replaced. And these institutions were built to be resilient in that particular way. They know their leadership is going to get killed. They know their, operational assets will be degraded, but can be rebuilt. That's how these were structured, because they don't have, air defense systems, and they don't have all these. They have tunnels or bunkers and that kind of thing, but they don't have air defense systems. They don't have an air force or anything to compete with Israel. So they know that they're going to get bombed by Israel's superior air force, but they're structured to be resilient. At the same time, I think you're right in pointing out that Israel can benefit from these external threats in numerous ways, both in the support they receive from abroad and in terms of having the outside threat to achieve some type of internal unity at various times. And you can see that Israel is pulling itself apart internally when that outside threat maybe doesn't appear as strong. Although at this moment, I think it's having problems even with the external threat.
Well, this is what I think is so fascinating about almost the need for an external threat, the need for Hamas or Hezbollah, is that this existential threat seems very important. I wouldn't necessarily say to Israel's existence, but certainly the likes of Netanyahu, who is a very martial leader, who seems to thrive on having an enemy. And this goes back to his UNGA speech, right, talking about we want peace. But I don't think Israel, they don't want peace, because peace to undermine really Hamas or to undermine Hezbollah would require a resolution, or at least a Palestinian state, right? Mm-hmm. Isn't that necessary to actually create peace?
Yes. If you recognize the Palestinian question as the source, as the root cause of conflict, then you're not going to have any settlement of that unless you address that through political means.
Do you think that is the root cause?
Yes, absolutely. There's no question to me that is the root cause of conflict, and that needs to be settled first. But the very ideology of Netanyahu and the right wing is about the extension of Israeli sovereignty over the entirety of the land from the river to the sea. I think Israel has always had a problem, even under left-wing governance, of coming to terms with the Palestinians, and there are numerous reasons for that. But this particular ideology from the Israeli right is really about the entirety of the land, and if it's about controlling the entirety of the land, then there is no resolution. And even in 2015, I remember the Israeli journalist Barak Ravid, who's now with Axios, but he was with Haaretz at the time, had some kind of leak or exposure in which Netanyahu was speaking at a Knesset Foreign and Defense Committee meeting. And he said, I'm not interested in a binational state, but Israel needs to control the land for the foreseeable future, all the land. And I'm asked Does that mean Israel needs to live by the sword forever? And the answer is yes. So that's his mentality, live by the sword forever. Degrade, both against the Palestinians and on the regional level, and just keep fighting indefinitely, using Israel's superior military and its backing from the United States to impose itself on the Palestinians on the region. I mean, there's also the theory of iron wall that was established by Vladimir Jabotinsky, one of the leading kind of thinker of the revisionist Zionist Israeli right wing. And it's about breaking the will of your enemies by being invulnerable.
Right.
This iron wall mentality, and I think that's what Netanyahu is trying to achieve. He even says it when we look at normalization or all these kind of things. It's peace through strength, not peace through making peaceful concessions about land or land for peace or any of that kind of thing.
That's not peace, though, is it? I mean, that's
no,
the thing.
Not.
It's like you can't live by the sword and say that you want peace. Living by the sword in perpetuity and say you're wanting peace is an inherent paradox. And I think we seem to have spoke about a lot of paradoxes here, which is probably makes sense given the context of what's happening. Israeli society, obviously, Netanyahu has been capitalizing off the fact that the quote-unquote escalation through de-escalation, which is an absurd phrase, has been met with some popularity amongst Israelis. How important is Israeli public opinion in actually determining what Netanyahu does, what Israel do, and what about the Israelis in general? How important they are in a political solution?
It's a very good question. I think in some sense they're fundamental, but...
Fundamentalist? Sorry, we can cut that bit out. I just couldn't help myself.
In some sense, they're fundamental to a resolution of this because, Israeli political leaders take their cues in some sense from the public, and in some sense they direct the public and shape public opinion. And I think you see both of that in Israel over time and even today. One of the interesting things is, a lot of people assume that Netanyahu was finished politically after October 7th, that he had so failed his people that, at the soonest opportunity or the nearest opportunity, he'd be removed from power. I remember, an interview I did 1 month in on, I think, November 6th with an Italian journalist, in which I was really pushing back on that. I thought, when I look at it, I don't see a mechanism in Israeli politics for removing a coalition government from power unless they lose their majority within the Knesset. And I don't see the parties that are in Netanyahu's coalition as abandoning them. The Likud party is his party fundamentally. I mean, he's really structured the party over a long period of time to really be so dominant. The ultra-Orthodox are dependent on Netanyahu for their financing, for their exemption from the military, all these things that the rest of the Israeli society is very hostile to, actually. And then the Israeli far right, these parties that he's brought in recently, have only tasted political power now through Netanyahu himself. And they are very excited about accelerating their agenda in terms of annexation and what they're doing in the West Bank. And so they're reliant on him. And so I didn't see that coalition collapsing so easily. At the same time, Netanyahu was using or could use the war to reshape his image and redeem himself and the Israeli public and their sense of vulnerability that I mentioned earlier through the use of force. And that's one of the, I've talked about Israeli genocide, and I think there are structural reasons for that. But even from a personal point of view for Netanyahu, I said at the time, and I've written since multiple times, that Netanyahu had to redeem himself in the eyes of his public. And one of the ways you can do that is through punishing the Palestinians violently. That always gets support, actually, among the Israeli population. You don't see people coming out into the streets to defend the Palestinians. Even when Israelis were in the streets for a year prior to October 7th about the judicial overhaul and what it meant, it was never about Palestinian rights or the occupation or any of those things. It was always had to do with the Jewish Israeli public and not the Palestinian public. And so there's definitely a callousness, a dehumanization to Palestinian life that is accepted within Israel. And it makes what the military is doing today possible. If Palestinians were recognized as equal human beings, the Israeli military couldn't go and do what it's doing in the Gaza Strip. And it couldn't do what it's doing in Lebanon. Okay, but because Palestinians have been so dehumanized over time in the eyes of the Israeli public, the military and the political leadership and echelon can go do it. And we've seen through polling that even there are polls where, a vast majority of Israelis are saying that the military is either doing enough or not doing enough in the Gaza Strip in terms of killing. At the same time, they're not shown, their media is not showing them what the military is actually doing there. So there's a disconnect there to some extent. Now, at the same time, and this is the final point I'll make, unless you have another question here, but the only way to change the political calculus in Israel is to change the calculus of the Israeli public by imposing a cost on Israel's behavior, both in its occupation, its apartheid, and in its regional behavior. And that can only come through stuff like sanctions and all these kind of things that impose a cost on the Israeli public. When they feel it, then their political leaders will feel the cost, and they'll change their trajectory of action. Hopefully, I mean that's what you'd like to see. But at the moment, they feel no cost. They've never felt a cost for the occupation itself, except in the periodic violence that comes out of the Palestinian resistance organizations. But besides that, there's been very little cost, and therefore we've moved in the opposite trajectory of a resolution of conflict. The settlements have increased, all these kind of things. And Israel, the Israeli public doesn't feel it. I mean, for a long time, it didn't see the occupation itself. It didn't see the settlements, all these things. They've been hidden from view to an extent from the Israeli public and a public that was willing to close its eyes.
Yeah, of course, one could even argue that the cost, violence, or at least violence that's erupted, isn't even a cost, because it seems that violence is exploited and leveraged then to expand settlements, to increase attacks, and to actually rally support for more violence against Palestinians.
Absolutely. It's how that is interpreted. Even the pullback from Gaza in 2005, the results that came from that, how the narrative is shaped has been very important. And one of the interesting things, and you can go back to even the 2000s or the late 90s, and how the failure of Oslo and the failure of the Camp David talks and all that kind of stuff were interpreted. And the Israeli left, those who were looking for a political resolution, undermined themselves in how they interpreted and narrated that failure to their own public, in saying, like, Ehud Barak would say, we have no partner for peace. Yasser Arafat is not a partner for peace. Well, if you have no partner for peace, how can you pursue peace? And if you can't pursue peace, then the enemies of peace within your own society, the Israelis right, who have always said we have no partner for peace, are the ones who were proven right. And then the left got stuck, twiddling its thumbs because, well, we just proved the Israeli right was correct. And so what was their political platform? And they were never able to come up with another political vision. They just kept going further and further to the right themselves and emulating the right, but they weren't the authentic thing. They were the fake thing. And so the Israeli left has dwindled in Israeli society, has no influence today. Everything is on the Israeli right.
Right.
And we've seen the results of that.
But you also mentioned just a minute ago now about the U.S. role. And obviously we can't have this conversation about what is happening in Palestine and Israel without talking about the U.S. and Lebanon and Iran. Israel often receives unwavering support from the US, which shields it from certain international repercussions. We know that. How has this impunity shaped Israel's approach to the war on Gaza and the wider region? And, is there too much emphasis on US support for Israel, or do you think without US support, things would be progressing very differently?
I don't think there's enough emphasis on U.S. support, to be honest.
Right.
The U.S. and its support for Israel, its unwavering support, has been decisive in shaping the trajectory of the past year, the outcome of the past year. I think it's become abundantly clear how much Israel depends on U.S. support. You can't even separate at this point where Israeli actions begin and U.S. or where Israeli actions end and U.S. involvement begins. I mean, the U.S. is supplying the planes, it's supplying the bombs, it's supplying the taxpayer-funded finances for Israel in the form of, I think we're up to like $20-something billion just since the war started.
The vetoes at the UN.
Yes, the vetoes, the diplomatic and political support, the intelligence support, the military support, the defense in terms of sending aircraft carriers to the region, The U.S. is bombing Yemen. The U.S. is bombing Iraq. The U.S. is shooting down missiles from Iran and from Hezbollah. So the U.S. has been instrumental, I think, in every step of the way here. And that, in the sense you're talking about Israeli impunity, when Israel doesn't face any consequences for its actions, it feels empowered and it feels emboldened to carry out the strategy as it sees fit. It also feels unhinged. Despite that American support, there is no American effort to really direct or restrain Israel. Biden can talk until he's blue in the face, or warn, or tell Israel don't do this or don't do that. But at every step of the way, when that's happened, and Netanyahu has wanted to go in a different direction, he's gone in that direction to no consequence. And so it really doesn't matter. Either Biden is completely ineffective,
right,
or he or people in his administration are supporting the Israeli agenda here. One way or the other, it's a total failure of U.S. policy. It's very difficult for the United States to exert leverage over Israel without repercussions back in its own politics.
Right.
And so politicians don't like to make those choices, but they can, and they have. I mean, again, when Israel went in 1982, it got the green light from the United States, but when it was just destroying Beirut, at some point, Reagan stepped in and stopped the Israelis. George Bush Sr. Also, and at various times in its history, this is the only time I think we're seeing with just no restraint whatsoever. I mean, just feckless words, which could be, again, it's either feckless, as in the United States is trying to influence Israel to stop, but it just can't, or it's running interference for the Israelis and creating some type of distance for itself. So politically at home, it's not as harmful for the Democrats. But at the same time, it wants Israel to continue to pursue this. I mean, we're seeing actually a lot of chest thumping in the United States since especially the killing of Nasrallah and the pager attack. That, oh my gosh, look at these advancements Israel's doing. We should be supporting this. But it's really short-term thinking. It's really thoughtless about outcomes and what the damage is, both to U.S. credibility, to the international system. I mean, there are so many costs to this that are not being thunk up because people are being seduced by Israeli military power, even though that power is not there without American full-fledged support for it.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that last point as well, because certainly even though, U.S. support for Israel is ironclad, and that always seemed to be the case, the rhetoric criticizing Israel from the U.S. and what they've been doing in Gaza seemed to have diminished from after, as you said, the Nasrallah attacks and the pager attacks. And now there's even discussions about using Israel's quote-unquote decapitation of Hezbollah to basically root for regime change in Lebanon. And this seems to be something coming also from the US. So it's almost like they're sort of now on the bandwagon. I don't know. That's the impression I get, but I could be wrong.
No, I mean, I think in certain circles that's true, and it's really crazy. I mean, it's a fantasy to believe that Israel, through dropping bombs, can refashion the Middle East in the interests of Israel and the United States. Israel spent 18 years in South Lebanon and couldn't change reality in its favor. The United States spent how many decades in Iraq and Afghanistan with all the power of the United States, with all the funding, with all the nation building that went on, that was spent. In Iraq, it couldn't do it, and in Afghanistan, it couldn't do it. And yet Israel, through dropping bombs from the sky, is going to refashion the Middle East. Through what? Through creating political vacuums that are going to be filled by you don't know who. So what? We're going to weaken Hezbollah to the extent that a new political leadership is going to emerge in Lebanon that's going to take the country in Israel's interest.
I mean, that's how Hezbollah emerged in the first place.
That's fantastical thinking. I mean, it's the height of hubris, really, because you don't know. In fact, Israel has done so much harm to itself and the reputation of the United States in the region. It has inculcated so much hatred among the population of the region that I can't imagine it moving in Israel. They may cow people, they may strike some fear, sow some fear, especially from regimes, but they're also sowing tremendous hatred for future generations in the way that 1948 did. You know what I mean? It's that kind of generational type effect.
Well, it's like you said earlier about ruling by the sword, getting people to essentially be afraid, although we know from experience maybe people will be fearful or disorganized for a certain amount of time, but they'll only come back and then resist. And that brings me back to the question, what is the future then of Palestinian resistance? I suppose resistance in the region, but let's talk about Palestinian resistance to Israel. I mean, obviously, there's no crystal ball. I mean, Gaza has been decimated. Hamas will not be destroyed ideologically, although maybe they'll change form or change, tactics, or even an ideology might develop. But how do you see the future of Palestinian resistance given what's happened over the past year?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's very fluid.
Right.
I think one thing the past year has done is show both the importance and the limits of armed resistance without a robust political and diplomatic strategy from the Palestinians. In one sense, you have the PLO and its leadership, which has been totally absent. But even before October 7th, it had become completely reliant on the diplomacy and the political side of things without any type of leverage that stems from armed resistance. And so, the Israelis didn't care any longer about it because they could just keep it. So there was no diplomatic or political process in motion. And then the PLO just sat there and became more kind of corrupt and authoritarian, or the PA. Hamas, on the other side, it has this resistance strategy, but and I think it made moves in recent years to try to develop the kind of diplomatic aspect of it, but Israel was very successful in keeping them ostracized and illegitimate in the international arena. And so they have no ability to influence the kind of politics or the diplomatic side of things, no ability to take the leverage of an action like October 7th may have given them and navigate or take advantage of it. And so this fractured Palestinian polity that exists is like kind of the worst of all possible worlds. So nobody can move forward. This is the peril of fragmentation that was already there for the past 17 years, but October 7th exposed like never before. And the Palestinians are basically rudderless. They have no political leadership at the moment. It is completely absent.
Who's the closest they have, do you think? If there is
there's nothing really. Yeah. You barely heard. Mahmoud Abbas has been invisible. I mean, he spoke at the UNGA and he spoke once at the Arab League summit, but has been totally gone. Besides of that, we haven't seen him at all.
Right.
He's again, I always compare him to like Zelensky. Whatever you think of Ukraine or whatever, but like Zelensky's there in every capital trying to rally the international community in defense of his people. To some success. And obviously the Palestinians are different than the Ukrainians in that sense in terms of the response they're getting from the West. Sure. But you have to try.
Of course.
You have to try. And there's, the whole world is getting behind the Palestinians besides a few. But it's happening from, Palestinians in Gaza filming their own destruction on their phone and winning this, the sympathy and exposing, Israeli brutality. It's not happening from the political leadership. And even Hamas, it's fighting for its survival in the Gaza Strip. Its leaders who are in Qatar and elsewhere have been dealing with the ceasefire negotiations that are going nowhere.
Well, one was
and some are being assassinated, on the international stage. So, and again, it doesn't have the power or the ability to kind of influence things diplomatically. It's just part of the structure. So the only really place you've seen movements from on the Palestinian side is at the grassroots level. And that's where that's been happening for years.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not new. That's not post-October 7th. The grassroots is where all the action is being taken on the Palestinian side.
Both internally and externally?
Yeah, and there are limits to that.
Yeah.
I mean, there are limits to how much you can achieve at the grassroots level, which is really disparate. You know what I mean? It's not cohesive and organized with an organized vision led by a PLO or led by an ANC in this sort of Africa. You had grassroots, but you had an ANC that was guiding it and kind of leading the political charge in the South African case. And the Palestinians haven't had that in a long time. It's been hollowed out.
Sorry, it's even, could you argue it's one of the most dangerous jobs in the world? Because if they were to have an effective leadership, there was almost every chance that person might be, killed or assassinated. Or, one of the strategies of Israel has always been to keep the Palestinian leadership divided, right?
Yeah.
So is this one of the factors that's also generated that lack of leadership?
Well, listen, there was a Fatah-led and then PLO-led national movement, liberation movement for decades. And Israel killed a lot of those leaders, and it killed, it tried to assassinate Yasser Arafat numerous times and failed. I mean, he had, a preternatural sense of survival. Nonetheless, and it's killing Hamas leaders, it's killing Hezbollah leaders. So that's just part of it. But what you need to build is, you don't rely on the leadership. You rely on a strong institution and a national movement that produces leaders and continues on, the struggle for liberation. I mean, it doesn't have to be necessarily leadership driven, although that's important, but it doesn't rely on that. So that's an aspect of it. But Palestinians need to rebuild that. They've been unable to because, at one level, the kind of factional divide, fractional fragmentation that's existed has been unable to be overcome. And there are reasons for that. I think a lot of it you can place at Mahmoud Abbas's at his feet. You know what I mean? He's kind of stood as an obstacle to that kind of reconciliation. At the same time, behind him are the Israelis who impose a lot of pressure at home because nothing happens without them in the West Bank. So the PA cannot operate without the Israelis. And then the Americans and the Europeans and the donor countries to the PA, he's wholly reliant on them. And so he's kind of doing their bidding, and they don't want to see reconciliation that brings Hamas back into the political structure. And so those things have stood in the way. I would say one more thing. It's just that, another one of the gains that's happened since October 7th is that, you've seen the International Court of Justice spring into action to some extent. Or at least be forced into action by either third state South Africa or by the UNGA, the ICC to an extent. Although the warrants that its prosecutors been seeking are just lingering at the court level. So we'll see what would happen to that. But then the exposure in local courts. I mean, we're seeing now in the Netherlands court cases going after Israel for interfering in the ICC by surveillance and spying on the justices and all that kind of stuff. And you can see openings that will happen in U.S. courts and European courts and all these places where Israel gets support and going after things like, there are laws in place that prevent the United States and European countries from providing arms to people that are violating international law and international humanitarian norms. Israel is clearly violating those things. And so you can start to put pressure on the government from moving forward through courts and through other things. Obviously, BDS will receive a lot of support. So there are openings here and pathways, I think, to find accountability and pressure and a way forward. But the Palestinians definitely need to get their political house in order to take advantage of those opportunities.
But this really brings me to that final question, and you've led onto it nicely. I mean, when talking about the lack of Palestinian leadership, you actually mentioned the fact that there was people with their phones documenting, the horrific violence exacted by the IDF. And obviously this is not a form of leadership, but this has been instrumental as in shaping global public opinion. And you mentioned at the very beginning, talking about Netanyahu's speech, that he'd lost a lot of credibility. Could the impact of global public opinion could it shift the future of the region? Could it be important in leading to a Palestinian state? I mean, we saw Spain, for example, recognize Palestine recently. Is there any hope here for optimism for Palestinians?
I think there is hope, and an optimistic future in the longer term, in terms of what that international solidarity and support, which has rallied to the Palestinian cause, will get. And we spoke earlier about Israeli dependence on the United States and on the West. And we're seeing a lot of that shift in public attitude towards the Palestinians happening in those places, right? In European states and including in the United States, on campuses, in the streets, and elsewhere. And then you look at the polling, the majority of Americans, are calling for a ceasefire. Many are calling for the United States to stop providing weaponry to the Israelis unequivocally. So I think is a lot of potential there. In fact, that is where the majority of the potential is, that and the international institutions I mentioned earlier. But within the halls of power in a lot of these states, Israel is still receiving a lot of support, and so there's there are structures that on which that support is based that need to be got at, basically. And at least I think those will hold in the immediate term. But like the future generations seem to be lost. I mean, the support is greatest among younger people who don't trust, the traditional media, which is the one kind of supporting the Israeli narrative and the U.S. narrative. They're getting their information elsewhere. They're getting it directly from what's happening in Gaza, and the way you and I both mentioned in terms of people documenting their own murder, mass murder, and destruction on their phones and sending that out digitally. And so, I think Israel has lost those generations in the image, including among the American Jewish population. I think the younger American Jewish population, many of them are breaking with support for Israel. And so I think that is also a fundamental trend that's going to be important in shaping the future. But, you hope that, the younger generations will sooner than later fill the leadership roles in the governments in all these places that support Israel. And that's the way to change things. I mean, again, Israel can't feel immune from pressure, or else its actions will reflect that. And I think we are seeing the actions today, or the behavior of an Israel which has been immune from any accountability whatsoever. And that leads to extremism and reckless behavior, and that's what we see today.
And ultimately, thousands and thousands are killed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Omar, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your amazing insights. And I look forward to speaking to you again on the podcast soon.
Thank you very much. Me too.
Thanks for listening to MEnbar, the podcast for the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts.